Right, okay, so I am Martin Moss, Senior Advisor in Green Infrastructure for Natural England, and I lead on the development and continuous development of the England Green Infrastructure Mapping Database, as I refer to it. And that is now, we released version 1.2 of the database back in January of this year, and we are up to our next, working on the next iteration, which will be 2.1. Why so many versions? I'll come to that later. I think it's one of these tasks, Pete referred to it as Herculean, and it is. I think if I'd known what was going to be involved at the beginning, I might have gone on leave, but I didn't, so I'm still here. This thing was big to start with, and it just continues to get bigger and bigger. We've got about 20 minutes today. I've tried to keep to 20 minutes or so to leave time for a good time for questions. However, it is a massive piece of work, and there is, I will show you where you can get an actual 1.5 hour deep dive into the mapping we did a little while ago. It's on the site itself. But before we go to the site, I'll go through a few slides. I think then we'll have a look at the site itself, and I'll come back again to a few end slides, and then we can open up for discussion. But I need to mention my two sponsors at the beginning of this. So first of all, the two big contexts within which this now sits, particularly in terms of funding. It is there and was originally designed to support the development and now the rollout of the England Green Infrastructure Standards Framework, which itself was formally launched back at the end of January this year. So that's now moving into a sort of delivery phase going forward with the 5 sort of core standards that are set out within there. But it's also part of the Natural Capital and Ecosystems Assessment Programme, which is a large programme to sort of really transform the availability, the quality, the scope of data about the environment, natural capital and our ecosystems across England, which is a multi-agency effort overseen by DEFRA itself, and Natural England is one of the partners in that. And this is a small project within the overall Natural England project as well. So although this is big, it sits in much bigger contexts as well. Some of you may have seen this before, but I'd like to start by outlining, why are we doing this in the first place? And I think the 4 key objectives we've had from the beginning are set out here. And the first is to provide a publicly accessible open data mapping resource at an England scale. Previously in England, lots of stuff has been done. I was involved in quite a lot of it, guilty, at various different scales, regional to local, all at different times, using different data, different approaches. They couldn't be added up. We couldn't get an England view, an England-wide, an England scale understanding of what all the data was saying. So this was the first attempt to get at scale with this sort of mapping and to provide it as open data. You can download it from data.gov. It's all OGL, Open Government License. You can have it, you can use it, you can change it, you can republish it. As long as you say credit where you got it, it's okay. Publicly accessible is a slightly interesting thing. We are not visible to Google. You can't find the site in Google. I like to refer to this as the government's probably least secret dark web project. But for various technical reasons, at the moment, you can't actually find the GI site through Google. We might change that, so you have to be sent the link, and if you haven't got the link, let me know at the end and I can post it up in the chat. So you have to be sent that to access the site, but when you do, you find that this is there to provide common access to data to all the mapping we've done across England, so that no area has access to less evidence about green infrastructure than what is provided through this means. And that previously we've had certain places have better evidence, better mapping than this, other places have virtually nothing at all. So from now on, no one has any excuse to have less than is presented here, and it provides evidence to support a range of national to local planning strategy and targeting needs, particularly at an England to local authority level. We do provide data at MSOA and LSOA level, but the closer you get to the ground, the more you sort of have to ground truth this thing, because some of the data isn't designed to work necessarily at that detailed level. But because of that, it is perfectly capable of being supplemented with local data to match your local mapping requirements. So what's it all about really? Well, it's all actually about understanding change and change detection long term. So this is not a project with a beginning, a middle and an end. It is a long-term thing that we will do. We're trying to understand change in terms of typology, the distribution and range of different types of assets, their location and distribution, but also, and in particular, therefore, how that affects people in terms of supply, demand, inequalities, performance and quality. How far down there can we get at the moment? We're not too bad at supply, getting our head around demand, pretty reasonably good at inequalities. Performance and quality, less so. You know, there's a lot of work to do before we can understand that in the way we'd like to. But overall, we want to know how the infrastructure as a socio-environmental infrastructure is changing. It's there to do a job. Is it doing that job? And secondly, underpinning that is the ecosystem. In particular, we have interest in the urban ecosystem, but we want to understand for the first time, really, the composition of our urban ecosystem, what its naturalness is, species diversity, and so on the basis that a healthy green infrastructure, in order to function properly, requires a healthy ecosystem to underpin it. So, a little bit about version progression. I mentioned version 1.1 was published in December 21, 1.2 back in January of this year. They come together now. That is what I call baseline version 1. We're not going to change version 1 anymore. It's frozen. And the work that we're doing now, moving towards version 2, is to be able to create the next iteration of the mapping, so that at some point in time, probably in 25, 26, we will undertake what I call the first quintennial, not quite 5-yearly, to change detection exercise. So version 1 is locked down because we want to compare version 2 with it. And version 2 is what we have to build in order to do that. And once we've built version 2, we will then move on in 25-6 to start to develop version 3. So this is a long-term change detection process. And the content is getting bigger and bigger. So we've now got about, 12 modules or so. Originally, it started out as a fairly straightforward accessible natural green space standards assessment for England, and it's just got bigger and bigger and bigger and continues to do so. Now, at this point, I'm going to get out of the slides and I'm going to go to the actual slide, the site itself. And just to point out, I mentioned there was a deep dive, 1.5-hour deep dive. So this is the green infrastructure website itself. So you've got home here. This is what you'll come to. Under resources, there's a bit about training. And the second one down is the deep dive. If you are like me and you've got Amazon and you've got BritBox and you've got Netflix, but you still can't find something to watch in the evening, there's an hour and a half of glorious green infrastructure mapping detail. It's a click of a switch here for you to enjoy in the future. That does literally take an hour and a half. Even that doesn't cover everything, so we can't cover the whole lot today, but this is the mapping database. This is actually the presentation. This is what you get on site. So underneath this, obviously, are the actual data themselves, which are in GIS format, and that's what you can download from.
Excuse me, Martin. We're still looking at the slideshow here, so we can't see a screen with the database on it. You may need to share a window.
Okay. Why would it do that? I don't know why it do that. That's really annoying. That's very strange. I don't understand why that's happening.
You might need to come out of Zoom and go back in and click on the window.
Okay.
So that you can share.
That's really, really annoying. Sorry. Why can't I do that?
Yeah, this may be a limitation of Zoom. It's sometimes a bit awkward when it's shared.
Can you see it now?
Yes, I can see that now. Fantastic.
Okay. You have to do new share. I'm used to Teams. So this is everything in the wrong place. So going back, this is the site itself. When you come into home, there are a range of options along the top. So here's the mapping. Here's the mapping guide, and here are the resources. So the deep dive is here, second one down, under training, and there it is if you want to sort of go into the hugely technical detail that you can do with this sort of thing. The mapping guide is here. I'll just show the introduction, because if you want to know where the data is, that's where it is. It's in the mapping guide, section 1, right at the top of the page, data.gov. You go there, it takes you to where you can download the actual data itself. But the map is a presentation of that data, and here it is. So we will zoom in. I'll look at some of the core things that we have to a place I know very well. So I'm sort of in Manchester at the moment, but I live here, so it's always good to look at a place you know best. So all the actual layers are on the left-hand side here, and they're modulated. They're in different modules, and they don't quite work as I'd like yet, but you can see there are various different themes, some of which are collations of sort of source data. So this one in particular, the green and blue infrastructure assets base is set out here. We have further specific source data modules, particularly around public rights of way, blue infrastructure, and then we have contextual information around designated and defined areas. So various things around biodiversity, historic landscape, blah, 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 open access land, national trails, etc. And then right down here, we also have some socioeconomic data, which we're going to expand. We used to have more. We've taken some out because we're going to redo things. So things like the IMD, population data, ethnicity, and so on. So they are therefore reference, but the core, the meat and the veg of this thing is what I call this module here. This is module 1. And within module 1, it says the all green and blue infrastructure map. Is it? Well, actually, it's not. It's all that we have at the moment. I prefer to call it the combined green and blue infrastructure map. So we brought together a whole range of different data sets, a large doff of the cap in the direction of the OS green space data. This is the open green space data. So everything on site is OGL. So we do, obviously, there is the premium data as well, which contains information about some of the white space here. But to start with, we can see that over here, there are large areas where here have been nothing, as it were, and that's because we haven't yet looked at the agricultural landscape. We're looking at options to sort of fill some of these gaps at the moment. So not every land parcel in England is represented in the mapping. That's crucial to understand. And over here, if we go into the urban environment, again, there's lots of grey space where we have, there's nothing in there. The reason for that is the data about what's in there, generally speaking, is not open data. So we can't show you what's in there, but what we can show you is that there is something there, because we've created what we call the greenness grid for the whole of England at a 250 metre square basis, using some of the OS master map topography data. So this is not green space, this is everything that the OS say is some sort of, well, probably it actually measures man-made surface. So the inverse of that is something which is not man-made, and each particular square is just deciled to a particular percentage. So 40.5% of that is man-made, 58 of that is man-made. We go into town, it climbs to 94%, and then right in the middle of town, 98%. So pretty great. There's still something in there. So it doesn't tell you what there is, but it does tell you that there is actually something there. If I just switch that off and go back to the actual assets themselves. So we've used a typology, which we had to create to support the fact that we're bringing different data sets together, which sometimes describe the same place, but not necessarily in the same way or with the same title. So we brought things together. We tried to reflect what is something like how it's called in the data. We've also maintained what I call data integrity, because data sets don't necessarily agree on the boundaries of a site, or it's necessarily what's in there. So if we go over here, for example, this is, as it says on the left-hand side, it brings up the information about this site. So it says we've got two sorts of information about this asset, one of which is Ordnance Survey green space data, which says it's a public park general, and 18.5% of that is man-made surface. But there's also its country park, separate data set maintained by Natural England. 17.3% is some sort of man-made surface, and that's because they don't quite agree in terms of the total extents. There is a difference in terms of what's actually mapped. Over here, this is just a public park, or it could be public park and local nature reserve. We can move in and see that there are some of the components within the site are included, they are mapped, and some are not. So there are various bits and pieces of the site which aren't actually in the data, other bits are. That's the blue bits, and we have sort of play space and so on down here. So a range of different assets brought together, including woodlands and water spaces. I'll just look at the woodlands. One of the things about the woodlands is people ask, if I click on it, why does it tell me it's a woodland and a woodland and a woodland? And that's because it's actually a woodland going back to, there are different data sets. So this is coming from the OS woodland data, it's a woodland. In the National Forest Inventory, it's a woodland, and it's also on the Ancient Woodland Inventory as well. So there are different sort of data sources, and they also have different boundaries, and sometimes they disagree. So there is woodland woodland in the OS woodland, which is not in the National Forest Inventory. There's woodland in the NFI, which is not in the OS woodland. And there is woodland in both, which doesn't necessarily agree exactly on the ground. So there are all sorts of issues about data, and we've taken the decision, we don't correct data, we don't generalize it, we maintain that data integrity. So I just go back. We have a whole range of assets out there. That's interesting. But of all the stuff that there is, we're particularly interested in what's accessible. So in terms of accessible, we've mapped everything like this. So if we brought, that's the total resource. This is the accessible resource, which is just in the green. And we can see it's a subset. So we've done this typologically. We've assessed certain typologies as accessible. There are 8 of them, and certain typologies as not accessible, and there are more of those. So to be accessible, you have to be what I call publicly accessible, which is it's a space which is either designed for public access, park, or you have a right of public access, such as access land, or you would expect to have access, usually, at least during daylight hours, like a public cemetery, and so on. So things like sports facilities and golf clubs are not included. They are different things. But these are the accessible spaces. So we have a resource across England that maps them all out. Or does it? Well, actually, we've just undertaken some work looking at margins for error. And there are two issues here, one of which is error in the data about how things are depicted or described. There's also error in the data about things which are missing, they're not in there. And there are also errors in the data, assets which don't exist, what I call phantom assets. So it's in the data as possibly some sort of green space, but actually if you go there, it's private land. So there's all sorts of issues with the data that we need to be aware of, and we've been drilling into those quite recently. They affect what you do next, because if there's error here, we use this as source data to fuel some of the assessments, particularly around accessible natural green space and so on. So once you've got error, once you've captured the error from the source data, it's maintained within this mapping until such time as the data is updated, changed, and we can re-import it and redo all the work that we want to do. So with the time that we have, as you can see, there are lots of modules we can't go through, and you will have opportunity to sort of explore them yourself if you want. This is the core sets of data. We've also got things like access points. We haven't done network analysis, but we do have the means to do that in the future. We've also looked at private assets. It's not just publicly accessible. The greenest grid gives everything green. The private assets are the gardens data, which is at the moment only for urban areas. We're going to change that. So we want to know who's got access, not just the parks, but also to the general greenness of the environment, and things like private assets, such as private gardens. So here we have, by LSOA, it will tell you how much there is in meters, but also how much per 1,000 people. So that's about 69 square meters per person, as it were. If we go over here, it's up to 90. If we go over here, it's down to about 4. So you can get an impression of the overall availability of different sorts of green resource at a fairly local level, LSOA. We use this data then to fuel different analyses, as I've said. So one of the main ones, and the reason this was begun in the first place, is the Accessible Natural Green Space Standards Assessment, which uses a subset of things which are deemed as accessible. So it's all the stuff which we think of as naturalness 1 and 2. Too much detail today to go into that. We're actually changing naturalness through another project at the moment. We've defined now a new standard of a set of 6 different angst standards, ranging from the smallest here, doorstep, which is a green space of at least 0.5 of a hectare within 200 meters, right the way through to the sub-regional, which is the largest, 500 square meters, so 500 hectare sites minimum within 10 kilometers. And we've buffered all those which meet the criteria to create the buffers map. So if I just bring the local one up, this is the most detail. And if I bring up all the accessible spaces, you can see that the buffer surrounds them. You can also see there are spaces which don't count. So if we pick that one, it's less than 0.5 of a hectare, it doesn't count. If we pick that one, it's over 0.5 of a hectare. Why doesn't that count? That's probably because it's not an eligible type of space. It's probably something like a cemetery, which doesn't count in the angst assessment itself. So each of these has its own buffer, so they just get bigger and bigger. And you can see in particular, these two don't quite correspond. That's because we use a slightly different set of green spaces. For the most local, we include playing fields, whereas in all the others, we don't include playing fields for various reasons, which are explained in the user guide and technical data. So we have, for each of the standards, there is a map of who's in, if you like, and who's out. We also have the profile map, which means you can click on any part of the profile and it will tell you at that point here which buffers are in, which buffers are out. So this one's in the 10, the 1, the 2, and the 5, but there's nothing in the 300 or 200 meters. So the next question is, does that matter? Well, it kind of depends on who's there, but this is giving you an understanding of collectively the overall picture in terms of access to natural green space. We have done work looking therefore who's in, what sort of percentage of the population are in here. So this one, there's about, I think it's just under a third of the population are actually in the angst doorstep buffer, but only 25% are in this buffer. That's the impact of the different sizes and the different typologies which are used. And for each of these, we now have a baseline sort of population figure of who's in, who's out. But it uses the straight line method, and everyone advocates to understand in detail using network analysis. We might be moving towards that, but it's hellishly complicated and we ain't got there yet. So we have incorporated information to say that we understand about barriers. These are major, if you like, national barriers, railways and major roads, motorways. You can also bring up through the Blue Infrastructure Network things which are rivers, streams, canals, which could operate as barriers, and then you can overlay the buffers like this to see, well, you can see this if there are people living here, they may have access to a space here in terms of distance, but in fact you've got to get across these barriers in order to do that, and that may or may not be possible. That requires local information, very detailed. We don't have that. So we've just said, don't forget there are barriers. The fact that we've got a straight line method doesn't necessarily mean you can get there in 200 meters. It may take you further. I'll just keep the Blue infrastructure map up here. So do we do blue as well? Yes, we do. And this is the network map bringing together data sets, mostly OS data sets, on most of the Blue infrastructure assets. It's fairly detailed and it's fairly accurate. There are one or two small things missing. I found a few myself, but it includes major rivers, water courses, water bodies, canals, and so on, but also line data on minor water courses, such as this one here. So it is pretty detailed, and we've subjected that to some kind of, an assessment of what's accessible as well. So which green spaces are accessible, which blue spaces are accessible. This is based on probability, so it's not an absolute, but we've assessed access to water side, not the water, if you're close to a right of way or it's within or next to a piece of access land. And overall, if you bring up this map here, everything which goes green, we think there's a probability that that is accessible water side. And if it's not green, then it probably not. We've done that for all England. We've also done recently an urban assessment where we drilled into the urban environment. This is not the best place to look at it, but in more detail, because the technique for England doesn't work that well for urban areas, because in urban areas there are very few rights of way. So we've had to look at urban paths as well, not roads, not pavements, but paths, and done a similar exercise. So if we bring up this particular assessment, that then tells you which bits in the urban area are likely to be and are not likely to be accessible. And that can be subjected to further analysis. We're starting to look at how we might be able to use that going forward. And there's a lot of statistical information underpinning that. So if you click on this LSOA, it will tell you lots of different things about how much of the various different resources there are, how much might be percentage-wise accessible, and how much might not be. I'm at 10:28. So very quickly, a couple of things before I start to come to an end. A lot of the data, there's been a lot of interest in, okay, what's accessible, what's not, but also inequalities of supply, across the country. And I'm just going to zoom out a little bit here and go to Rochdale and bring up the access inequalities maps. I'm just going to look at this one, which tracks the amount of supply of accessible green spaces versus the index of multiple deprivation. We're not implying any causality here. It's just a spatial relationship, as it were. And if we bring up this map here. We can see we've used a sort of grid-based approach here to do bivariate analysis, a posh way of saying we're comparing one thing with another. And there are various different classes, there are 9 classes, different classes of access inequality, ranging from L1, least favorable, to H3, most favorable. So this is, these are thresholds. So this is 0 to 5%, 5 to 50%, over 50% coverage of that area in terms of green space and its attendant buffer. And then these are the IMD factors. So L1 are most deprived, L3 least deprived. So that's deciles 1, 2. This is deciles 9 and 10, and everything else is piggy in the middle. So this characterizes each LSOA by, this approach to understand who has, I guess, better overall access versus those that don't. So we can see this area here are a range of different L1s. So this is least favorable and quite a lot of them all together. So if I'm interested in addressing inequalities in green space, and I'm also interested in working in deprived communities, this is the sort of place which starts to pop up as interesting to look at. Bear in mind, it's based on LSOAs. They don't represent communities. They're not physical things on the ground. It's a statistical geography, but it's starting to help us to target activity and therefore resources and investment into those places where we think we understand the issues exist that the resources are meant to try and address. In the final few minutes that I have before I open out a little bit, we've done the same for population density. Just very quickly, if you bring up the population density map, what you get is a different picture because it's tracking a different aspect of interest here. So this is about, I guess, how much there is per person supply versus how many people versus demand in many respects, rather than just tracking supply against levels of deprivation. All the information we've had to date on spaces where you can go are what I would call publicly accessible spaces. So it's there, as I've said, it's provided for accessible. There are lots of other spaces out there, which we call accessible to the public. Normally this is private land, which the actual owner is providing some form of access to. We've started to therefore collate data about what we call permissive access sites. At the moment, we've got data from the National Trust. I'll have to zoom out to get some of it over here. So this is National Trust Always Open, and we've put together some information from our wildlife trusts, but there's a whole range of organizations we're trying to encourage to supply us with data and the permission to put it on here. That's crucial. There's quite a lot of open data out there from different organizations, which when you look into the terms and conditions don't match OGL, and that's one of the issues that we've had to face. We've also put together a little bit of information around coast and coastal access, which is still in development, and we tried to sort of put a toe in the water on the sports play and active recreation side. So bringing in the sort of remit that Sport England would have and trying to supplement the OS data with Sport England data to give a much more nuanced understanding of opportunity out there. Right, I'm just going to try and come back out and back to my presentation, if I can find it. Here we go. So you should now be able to see my slides again. And I've put in, circulate this, just a few sort of highlighting slides of some of the content I've just gone through. But I'm going to just go back to this slide here. And I can't get, yeah. Come on. Okay, get rid of you. So a few things on what's coming up next. That is not it. That is version 1.2. Version 1 is closed. Version 2 is being built. So we're likely to publish the next iteration in January 24, building a lot of content. There's so much stuff on the way, but also crucially changing the date. As I've said, the version 1 is based on all the population data is census 2011. That's deliberate because we want to do change detection. So it's all using census 2011 data, and version 2 will be based on census 21. So we're currently upgrading all the environmental data, and we're now starting to import the census data to rerun a lot of the things I've just gone through there, which look at population data. So that will be the first update. We can start to do a little bit of experimentation with change detection. Also quite a lot of work looking at urban functionality and needs. So there's been a focus on getting the asset maps together, looking at accessibility, access inequalities, and so on. We're moving into other territory, one of which is, I guess, more of a sort of ecosystem service driven agenda. So particularly focused around climate change adaptation, so urban heat, air quality, but we're also looking at things like urban food production, and there's one or two other things in the pipeline that we'd like to develop as well, taking a bit of time, but some of that content we hope to be ready for January. And a major new project looking at urban habitat and naturalness mapping. Habitat information in the urban environment is quite patchy, to say the least. So we've developed a new Earth observation based approach, we think, to be able to map those habitats, a different approach in development to look at naturalness as a proxy for quality. So I mentioned we're not quite in the quality sphere yet, we're trying to get there. So it is an experiment, but we're also starting to put a toe in the water, some experimentation around species data as well. So we can have an urban habitat map which gives you what is there, a naturalness map which gives you some understanding of quality, and overpinning that a species layer which gives you some understanding of what's living there. Then the information we have around sort of urban nature recovery in particular comes into a different realm. We did have some health data in version 1.1. We've taken that out because we're working with the Office for Health Improvement and Disparities to develop more informed health and green infrastructure content. So something hopefully available in January, but this is another area which is going to take time to develop. And the blue infrastructure work, I didn't really go into very much detail, but we are also exploring quality in terms of blue infrastructure as well. So we've just finished phase 2 of developing a possible approach to understanding blue infrastructure experiential quality, which is to say, if we know where the blue infrastructure is and we know if it's potentially accessible, that's great. But what's it like when you get there? What's the quality of the place? So again, we're moving into, or trying to move into, that quality space. And my final slide, really, issues and challenges. There are, there's a whole presentation here. There's so many of them, one of which I mentioned, data confidence. We have all sorts of issues with data error and disagreement, and we're battling really to try and understand those, to give an understanding of the data confidence. When you look at that map, how confident can I be that what I'm looking at represents what's on the ground? The answer is we think there's about a 10% margin for error in the data, but we also think there's probably at least a 10% error derived from the fact that things simply aren't in the data or don't appear to be in the data, certainly not in the open data. So there could be a compound margin for error of up to 20%, which is a bit big. So 1 in 5 probability of being wrong. We're facing a lot of demands, I suppose, for the extraction of data from the database. It's not that easy. We're doing what we can, but we want to do a lot of work to improve how we can actually manipulate the database. And that will also involve improving how we can update it. At the moment, it's not friendly. It's not easy to update at all. So there's quite a bit of work to take this into a more efficient databasing environment in the future.